So hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Michael Anton Fischer, co-founder of Opago Pay and author of the wonderful book, Bitcoin Nation. Michael, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Not a problem. Absolute pleasure. I really enjoyed the book, audiobook in this case. I listened to it on Spotify. People can check that out as well. I'll put it in the link below. So I think what I want to do is split this into two parts, the interview, basically. I want to talk about
Like the book.
Exactly like the book. Well, I mean, that feels like a very natural way to do it. So I want to talk about banking and money generally, and then a little bit about, obviously, Bitcoin itself, and then move on to your ideas about digital citizenship. So why don't we start with something that people who listen to this show a lot will know that I talk about a lot, which is central banks. So in your book, I was very interested to learn that they're a very new concept. So would you like to explain to people what the world did before central banks and then why maybe they came into existence?
The book goes back actually 100 years because I was always interested in economics, but did actually study engineering. And with the engineering knowledge going in to study economics, I quickly realized that just doesn't work out what they're telling me. So I then started looking for other sources. I came across the Austrian School, but I also came across Alfred Landsberg. And Alfred Landsberg was basically a Jewish English banker who immigrated to Germany the end of the 19th century, actually, with his family. And he then basically started working in a bank, started writing about banking and money. And he was the first conspiracy theorist because already in 1919, he predicted the hyperinflation that would later come in 1923. And he even in 1921 already described the solution that they then implemented in 1933 that stopped the hyperinflation within 1 week. And the fascinating thing is I came across his books, I think 2019 or 2020. I read them and I was so fascinated that I actually translated them to English and with the help of my cousin to French as well. And when I was doing this, I thought, it's almost 100 years. So you have to read the letters. He wrote it in a style of letters. You have to read these core books that he wrote between 1921 and 1923. You have to read the letters exactly 100 years after they came out. And the crazy thing is when I was reading these letters, I basically could put my newspaper next to it and some of the things he discussed, what the media said, what the politicians said, basically some of these things were verbatim in the papers being said by politicians 100 years later. And that was what really kicked me down in the rabbit hole, as they say, and started me really digging into it because I was like, that's kind of not good if you're repeating the errors we did 100 years ago that led to the Weimar hyperinflation. And so this really kicked off my interest into money. And the crazy thing about Landsbergis or Argentarius, his pen name, that he wrote really precise and really simple to understand. He wrote really for the layman, most of his books. And one of his best books, one of his late books, 1930, is Das Kapital, or Capital. So he cheekily stole Marx's title. The crazy thing is in this book is it's like 89 pages. So when I republished it in Germany in modern typesetting, I actually had add the long form of his biography at the end that Amazon would actually print it because you have to have, I think, 100 pages or so. And in that book, in 89 pages, he debunked both common capital theories, so Marxist, obviously, but also that of Adam Smith, and then put up his own very, very understandable capital theory. And that's really what he could do like no other. Put it really short, really simple. So with my book, I actually spent a lot more time shortening it than writing it because I wanted to get to his level. I didn't fully. It took me still 150 pages or so, but I really tried my best to make it as simple and as short as possible.
Yeah, that's one thing I actually really appreciated about the book. It was very easily consumable. Like you didn't labor any points. You really sort of just were like, here's my ideas, here's like the explanation, you know. See,
I mean, I did originally, but I cut it out.
Well, you're a better man than me because my first book ended up at 400 pages. So, and then the second one was meant to be much shorter, and it's turned out to be basically the same, but it's not done yet. Maybe my editor will fix it. But I wanted to ask before we move on to some of the other questions I wanted to ask, could you explain for people what it was that caused the hyperinflation in 1920s Weimar Republic Germany, and then maybe also touch on the thing you said he implemented a solution that fixed it within 1 week, just so people have a good idea. And also, I think it's probably very useful in today's context.
I mean, it even did take Landsberg 3 books to fully lay that out. Because you have to understand both the national workings of money, the international workings, and central banks, which is why his trilogy of books, and he then added a fourth one describing what actually happened as it was playing out, what he predicted. But essentially, there were 2 major factors for the Weimar hyperinflation. The first one was obviously paper money being printed like crazy. But the reasons why paper money was printed like crazy were twofold. One were basically the reparations. So Germany had to pay crazy sums of money to the victors of World War I in gold. So they couldn't print that. And the second portion was that there was a trade war going on. Because when one country devaluates its currency, and it's an industrial country, what happens is that it floods the rest of the world with cheap goods. So essentially, it steals the labor of its people with printing money and exports that. So the other nations were putting higher and higher tariffs, and there was really this international trade war going on. The mechanistics of gold currencies competing with a paper currency played out. And obviously, just basically, I think it was like 60% or so of their GDP that they had to pay in reparations. It was just a very, very deadly mix. But in the end, it was probably good because that mix was so deadly that it played out rather fast. Because the longer inflation takes, the longer fiat money or paper money is in the system, the worse the consequences are, because you actually erode the capital stock. And I mean, usually paper currencies last, or fiat currencies last less than 50 years usually. On average, I think 30-something years.
Really?
But the dollar is really overdue with, what is it, like 53 years now?
Yeah.
And on full paper standard?
71 or 2?
The longest currency that stood the longest, the last fiat currency was actually, I think, the Roman one, as far as I know.
Yeah, the denarii.
And they gradually devalued it, and then even then there were still, you had to pay taxes mostly in gold and silver. So it was not a full fiat standard, but it was like, I think, 160 something, 170 something years from really being 0% silver and gold in the regular coins to Rome falling. But Rome falling arguably was one of the worst events in the history of civilization. I mean, it threw us so back, 1,000 years back in many sciences. And in some sciences, like philosophy, I think we haven't recovered this to this day. I mean, if you read Marcus Aurelius, is there any philosopher that comes even close to that guy? I don't think so.
I mean, there's a reason we're all still reading his book at this.
Yeah, and the crazy thing is, 3,000 years ago, Greek philosophers, I forget the name constantly, but there's one Greek philosopher that I think 300 something years ago, 3,000 something years ago, already explained why a money needs to have a constant supply to work properly. And that really the issue is how to keep that supply constant, or as close to constant as possible. And for 5,000 years, gold with the supplement of silver for smaller transactions simply was the best technology we had for that problem. But it also had some fatal technological flaws that allowed for this cycle of devaluation, then fiat money, then collapse, and gold standard again to happen. So overall, I think that's something that studying history taught me, that while we humans think we are free, and we are. I mean, even right now, you see there's fiat money and everything's basically economically falling apart, but Elon Musk is inventing robots with his team, launching rockets. Yeah. Well, outstanding people can achieve a lot, whatever you throw at them. But overall, human history is a story of technological limits. I say basically there's a bandwidth that the technology allows us to be in. And basically, we bounce between the upper and lower bounds of standard of living, of societal organization. And then either we lose the technology and fall down, or we gain a new one and move the band up. But basically, breaking out of these bands always requires some great breakthrough. And monetary cycles, monetary technologies is one of the biggest factors there that I could ever find in all of history.
So one of the things that brings us beautifully to one of the things that was really interesting to me in the book was the discussion of the 4 stages of a currency, basically, the cycles of money. Was it 4 stages of currency? I believe it was, right?
Maybe you know this book,
The Fourth Turning? Yeah, that's why I was going to ask about it.
And the funny thing is, the fourth turning, these 4 cycles, they're basically always lagging the monetary cycles for a few decades behind. So basically, 4 monetary cycles always precede these cycles. And 100 years ago, Argentaris said that basically such a minor or major, but a monetary crisis happens to a society roughly every 100 years, or whenever the last generation who witnessed it is gone. And it's crazy that he wrote this basically almost exactly 100 years ago.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would point at 2008 as being that crisis, but it sounds like you think that we're still yet to approach like what the actual, what that crisis might be.
I mean, it's a long crisis. One thing that allows people to get away with devaluing a currency for so long is that the effects have years and decades delay, and the worst effects have sometimes a generation delay. So basically, a generation that makes the error is not the generation that suffers the consequences, which is why it's so hard to learn from it. And basically, the only thing that really prevents us is the people that witness monetary crisis saying, no, don't do that. We did that once, that hurt. And whenever that generation is gone, that knowledge is gone, basically. That's the lesson. And if you look at it, it's eerie because really there's smaller cycles that basically go devalues, and then there's a crisis and there's one, and then there's bigger cycles with actual fiat money, but there's a variation to the cycles. But these 4 generational cycles are really, you can really very well correlate them to historic events, and they always go hand in hand with monetary cycles. So I would say causal reasons. So I think there's a good argument to make that is not just correlation, but actually causation.
So what would you expect to come soon in this end of in the 4th turning, basically? What would you think that we are going to be looking at? Just like economic collapse?
Crazy thing is, we never before in human history had a world economy on pure fiat money. That never happened. So it's hard to predict how it will play out. You can say some things about what will happen to the capital stock, what will happen to society, but you cannot really say when it will end and how bad it will get, because the one major factor that ends normal paper currencies is that they basically trade with other nations that have a gold standard, or the bimetallic gold-silver standards market. And basically that limits how much that nation can do in shenanigans. Because this is something that in the second book of this 4-part series in Valuta, Argentaris describes very well how these dynamics work. But now we have paper currencies competing with paper currencies. And as long as basically the dollar is the leading currency, all the other countries that trade in the dollar, that are hooked up to the euro-dollar system, need to just print slightly faster than the US. If they print slower, they basically, all the prices, the international currency shoots up, as it happened to Switzerland. And that's really bad for their own exports. And if country prints too fast, then it happens like Zimbabwe, Argentina, Venezuela, they just go into hyperinflation. But as long as all the others stay printing at slightly faster pace than the US, that game can theoretically go on. Unless people at some point say, hey, wait a second, we just had a bailout where you printed 1000x the GDP. We don't tolerate that anymore. But it really takes a lot for people to actually not only catch on broadly, but actually take action against such a deflation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of the times like discussions about money are very abstract. Like, it's difficult for people to grasp. It's like, I ask a lot of economists and people I talk to about this, like, what is money? And they give me long, detailed, like very philosophical answers. And if I just ask someone on the street, they'll just be like, it's what I pay for things with.
That's a crazy thing. It's actually pretty easy, which Argentaris proved 100 years ago. But it's part of what keeps the system running, that ordinary people don't know it. And
no one teaches me, like it's not something that.
Do you know Rahim Tayyip?
No.
He came originally from Iran, lives in Austria, or I think he moved to Switzerland, but lived for a long time in Austria, and basically was the biggest Austrian economist in Austria in this century, and or is still, just not in Austria anymore. Like so many other Austrian economists, he left Austria, and he explained in a very, very nice book, so the basics of Austrian economics. And what he wrote is that essentially the reason in Austrian economics has such a hard time is that there's not a real industry for economists. Really, the main job of an economist, or the main market for economists, is writing paper for governments and central banks to buy. And these papers obviously have to affirm the central bank. And it's quite hard. I mean, even Argentaris in his book about the central bank, only between the lines was able to write that it's completely nonsense. In the end said, yeah, maybe there's some place for a central bank, because he couldn't at the time, especially as a converted Catholic but born Jew in Germany in the 1920s. He simply couldn't say, no, sorry, central bank is complete nonsense, you have to abolish it. He had to dance around that concept, even though he very, very clearly implied it in his books. He couldn't say it out loud, and that's really the issue that the job of an economist is not to explain the economy, but it is to actually justify whatever the leaders want justify.
Yeah, that's a very nice and also horrifying way of putting it. Do you think what you said there about other governments need to print money maybe just a tiny bit faster than America, basically, is that why this policy of quantitative easing has spread so far? Is that why there's like so many developed nations are just taking part in that, just money printing?
But I mean, in the end, to really discuss this, we would have to go into the inner workings of the euro-dollar system, which has nothing to do with the euro. It's much older than the euro, but that, I think, really explaining that takes several hours. But in a nutshell, it goes back to what Argentaris explains in Valuta. Every transaction is ultimately settled in goods and services. Money is just a medium of transaction. Basically, besides a drug deal where you really exchange the money and the good directly at gunpoint, it's not possible to do transactions with the person at the time, most of the time. So you need a way to postpone a transaction in time, place, and often person. And that's really in the end what a money is. How to build a money that does that very well and how to evaluate it is another topic. But essentially, a money is just a tool for postponing transactions. And so if you think in the moment you get a dollar bill or a euro bill or a gold coin that you have been paid, that's false. What you really need to think about is, when I spend that, will it buy me the goods that I want now, or would it be better to barter right now? And basically, if you say, in my grandfather's generation, there were still very common in the rural parts of Bavaria that actually the employees of a landowner lived in his house, worked the fields, and they didn't get really paid. They got housing, they got food, and they were allowed to sell a portion of the produce they produced for their own benefit at the market. So what many of these people didn't realize when they switch later on, especially for simple grounds by the government, when they switched to being paid in money, they didn't really think about, would that paper money actually buy them the same housing, the same food, the same fair money for drinking at the pub or whatever, than the previous agreement with their owner did. And what happened in Germany, what was so devastating, is that basically with the aftermath of World War I, it didn't. So and then World War II again happened, and basically each generation had a complete reset of the purchasing power, and they didn't get anywhere really until the late 50s and 60s. And the stark thing is that so many people get fooled by that idea and sell themselves poor, even skilled businessmen. So this is what happened in 1923, that people basically, he describes it with a perfume store owner where he wants to buy a gift for his wife. And basically the man gets angry when he asks to buy the perfume. He says, I won't sell that because last week I sold all my bottles and now my store is only half full because I couldn't even stock up again. That's the price had risen so much. And I mean, in the hyperinflation, you see it because you notice, okay, I sold last week so many bottles. And now with the paper profits I made, I can still buy less bottles than I could buy last week. But when inflation is slower, it's much harder to notice that.
Yeah. So, to go back a little bit, we've talked a lot about how there's been resets, about how a lot of our current system is very new. And one of the things you mentioned in the book, which was very interesting to me, especially since I just listened to the Trump Rogan interview where they talked about the Gilded Age and the prosperity of the 1800s. And so you say in the book that the era of free banking was the most prosperous in human history. Could you elaborate a little bit for people on that for me?
I mean, the crazy thing is that almost anything in this room, the core technologies were invented between 1850 and 1910, and then they were really only refined. And that's so stark because basically the US central bank was only put in place in 1913. So even though there's a real lag, you still saw even before 1913 that they were devaluating the dollar by preparing the central bank. Even that already can be seen if you look at the economic data from the US. Really, the US was the leader there because they were the freest country at the time, and they basically in the second half of the 19th century, after the Civil War, they abolished the central banks, and basically was the spirit that nobody talks about today anymore, but there was really the spirit of, we don't want any politician to ever have the power to wage such a war again. So they dismantled the central bank. They destroyed a lot of agencies. They basically, the federal police was completely private. There were private detective agencies. Otherwise, there was only a statewide police. There was no FBI and stuff. And arguably, the FBI from the beginning was more corrupt than these agencies. And these agencies, when they got corrupt at the end of the 19th century, was mostly due to federal politics meddling in the process and basically banning many of them from doing their job. But all this, when you hear this, the Wild West, the headhunters, this was such a chaotic situation. I mean, obviously, it was a less developed time, so it was much easier to get away with crime, which the easier it is to get away with crime, the more crime happens. It's just the nature of the thing. But even so, it was arguably much more organized, and most people had much more freedoms and rights than they have to do today. You might argue, yeah, women's rights and stuff, but yes, women learned a lot to vote, and there were many other negative things for women. But overall, these federal rights, what you were allowed to do federally, didn't actually really affect people's life that much, because basically if you lived somewhere out of the greater Washington area or the East Coast area, the federal government had almost zero influence on life. And this freedom, basically, with a hard money, where basically banks were competing with their gold certificates, and nobody would bail them out. So people actually had to think about, hey, will this bank keep my gold safe? Will they be robbed? Will they basically give out more certificates than they actually have gold and awards? All this led to a dramatic shift. It was like over 80% of people were living in extreme poverty before, and it was, I think, around 20% or even less after. So it was a drastic shift, and so many technologies and so much wealth gained in just a time span of 60 years. Really, like the lifetime of the average lifetime of a person. And then basically this all really quickly reversed in 1913, when the income tax and the Federal Reserve were invented. And this all basically, Mises at the very early predicted that this would lead to 1929, eventually to the Great Depression. And the biggest marketing trick in the books is that basically there was a Great Depression already in 1921 in the US, which was caused by big fractional reserve and other factors.
Really?
But this actually lasted less than a month for the economy to recover. But Keynes and other economists and politicians said basically, this was so bad, the next time this happens, we need to intervene, need to do deficit spending and all of that. They said that this we need to do in the next time because this was so bad. And Mises pointed out at the time, no. What you're doing that caused this will cause a bigger crisis. And if you do what you suggest, then that crisis will be forever. And it turns out he was exactly right. But for some reason, Keynes managed to pull off the marketing trick that to this day, in universities, you will be taught, 1929 was a deflationary crash because of the gold standard. And then basically Franklin Delano Roosevelt solved it. No. The crash was because of fractional reserve, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt made sure that the US to this day has not recovered from the crash. They were able to push a lot of the bad consequences to other countries by winning World War II, but essentially the real income of that ordinary worker did never ever reach pre-1929 levels again. And the US debt also always only increased since then, and the dollar amount only increased. So if you look closely, even with two very profitable wars and being able to push a lot of the bad consequences off to other nations, they never recovered, exactly as Mises predicted.
Wow. It's really like the real terms wage has never got back to pre-1929 levels.
I mean, it's really tricky to compare these wages because you have to actually compare with the same goods. If you say, oh yeah, there's now a computer that wasn't there then, and it wouldn't have been possible, and the computer would have cost billions to make. But if you just look at a say, a normal suit in the store. Basically, the normal worker could afford it back then. Right now, it's hard for most normal workers to just buy a suit. Houses were like, a decent house was 2 or 3 average salaries in good neighborhoods. I mean, now even the bad ones, you don't get it for 2 or 3 average salaries. And the crazy thing is, I mean, even gold lost, because gold actually has inflation, and also there's always some kind of manipulation in the gold supply and in the gold market.
Yeah.
And the gold bugs always say, if you had like 10 kilos of gold, you could buy a house in 1910, and now you can also buy a house. But what they forget to tell you is that in 1910, with 10 gold bars, you got a really, really good house in a really good part of town. And now for the same 10 gold bars, you get a decent home in the suburbs of not top 10 city.
Yeah.
So even gold has a loss of purchasing power, but nothing compared to the dollar.
Yeah, I mean, well, there's I'd say theories. The US government has given themselves in legislation the ultimate right to intervene in any gold market in the world in order to protect national security, I think was the justification. I'll have to go back and check.
Well, Aguinaldos explained so well, they cannot compete against gold. And to be frank, that fiat system can only be ended by, as Hayek said, a sly way of bringing around a better currency, and then that better currency just has the same effect of competing against gold and destroys the fiat system. I think really over the next few decades, we'll see both a Bitcoin and a gold standard compete, is my personal prediction. And in the end, it will not be, will the dollar win against Bitcoin, but really will Bitcoin win against gold?
So I want to come back to that question, but just before we move on to that, because that I want to ask about a little bit more about the era of free banking, because so I walked on the street, in London, or I could go to New York or California, or somewhere, nice, Texas, like. No, they're all nice, I'm sure, in some ways, but. There's loads of different banks. It seems like there's a lot of competing entities here. Like what was different back then that is like the era of free banking? Because I could go and bank with Nationwide or Lloyd's or HSBC or some of the new internet banks, Starling or Monzo. Like what was different back then that makes it be described as the era of free banking?
We have to talk about what makes a good monetary token. Because you have to really separate. Money is a concept, is what I want to do. Is like, I want to drive a nail in a wall. Then is money, I want to postpone a transaction in time, person, and place. And what many people forget is the separation between the tool and the concept. If I say, what makes a good hammer? You say this, the longer the handle, the more force it has, and the heavier and more rigid the head of the hammer is, that's the better hammer. And if you apply these standards to nail gun, you would say a nail gun is a terrible hammer. But still, the nail gun is much better at putting nails in the wall. And that's the thing also by many gold bugs, or even Austrian school educated gold bugs don't get Bitcoin, because they say money needs to be a hard token, it needs to last long, and the way basically they confuse the hammer with putting the nail in the wall. And gold, while having been the best monetary technology for 5,000 years, has several downsides. I mean, money is usually, I've heard these usually 6 criteria that are put up. Scarcity, most important, vital one. As I said, the number needs to be constant, because value is always subjective and also not algorithmically processable, because your valuations are actually at any time relative. You cannot say, oh, my dog is worth double my cat and my children are worth 3 times the dog. That's not how your subjective valuations work. You would say, if the house burns, I will say first my kid, then my dog, and then my cat, maybe. or the other way around. I feel like the cat more than the dog.
Or the dog more than the kid.
This means that value is not objectively measurable. The only thing you can measure is when two places in this hierarchy of valuations meet. So when we trade, when I say, hey, I give you 1,000,000 Satoshis and you give me a notebook or something, right? Nobody knows that
Deal.
I value the notebook at 1,000,000 Satoshis and you value otherwise the 1,000,000 Satoshis as highly as your notebook. Because basically if I bargained harder, you maybe would have given it to me for 500,000. And if you bargained harder, maybe I would have given you 1.5 million Satoshis. Nobody knows that. But objectively verifiable, our valuations met at this point. And if you look at all the trade, there is basically a price where you can get a good of a certain quantity at a certain place. That just, with a lot of transactions, that just turns out this is the market value, which is objectively measurable, but has one issue. In which unit do you express it? Because the value is objective and also not ordinal, so not you cannot use normal algebra for it. You cannot multiply it, you cannot add it, you cannot subtract it. So if you measure something, there's two ways of doing it. Like first a kilo, you just have this heavy rock, and so that's 1 kilo, and we compare everything to that one rock. Or you say, more advanced, we have some natural constant, like light moves at this speed. And so we just say a second is a certain fraction of that or so. Or I think they actually use the time it takes for certain atoms to decay, right? These days.
Yeah.
Originally, they had also reference unit, but then they said, we need to have something more objective. The second way of measuring something that is to basically norm it on the whole. You say, okay, there's like humanity, and I'm one of 8 billion pieces, and the whole thing is humanity, and there's 8 billion pieces. And since valuation is subjective, the only thing you can do is norm to the whole thing. You can say, okay, this whole economy uses one money, and the number of monetary tokens obviously has to encapsulate or reflect like a mirror the value of all the transactions. That's easy to see if you have something like this. Is why I used the beer tent example in the book. Mm-hmm. If you have monetary tokens like in a beer tent that are ripped apart, invalidated after use, it's easy to see. If you have 1,000,000 liters of beer, 1 token is 1 liter, you need 1,000,000 tokens. That measures the beer. It's a bit difficult, more difficult in the actual economy where we reuse the token. Because then you have to take in mind that how often every token in the economy moves times their number must reflect all the goods being transacted and their prices. That's the Fischer equation, unfortunately not related. Or maybe I can be glad because he also said a lot of nonsense, but that equation is one of the greatest insights in economics. So economics is next to impossible to study empirically. So you really have to look at what has to be logically true. What can I deduct from logic that has to be true? But Austrians always call this the a priori facts. And this equation is one such fact. There's no way that mathematics is correct and that equation is wrong. That it's true by definition. Still, both on the Austrian economic side, on the Keynesian side, and on the all these others like modern monetary theory, right? All of them often derogate that equation because it's very easy to misuse or deliberately misunderstand. Because basically, since it has 2 parameters on both sides, it's very easy to say, if I turn this one parameter on this side, this parameter on the other side has to move. And we just ignore that the other parameter also can change in accordance. And that's basically when they say that a constant money supply causes a deflationary crash, they basically ignore the monetary velocity, that each token can just circulate or more often in the economy. And actually, that's the actual process. So, because they say a growing economy needs more monetary tokens. That's exactly backwards. Because the growing economy means people are transacting or doing more transactions, the money moves faster. So each token actually mirrors the higher transaction volume. So a growing economy needs less monetary tokens, not more, actually.
Okay, sorry, I was just trying to get my head around that concept. That's okay. So that brings us nicely to the idea of Bitcoin, which is the whole reason for your book. So you've said there that gold and Bitcoin might become competing attempts for people to back currencies with something more, hard again, to go back to a hard money supply. Is that basically what you're getting at? You think
only the number of tokens. Because the gold is not valuable because gold itself is valuable. Actually, a monetary token is the less usable its materials. It was always pretty, but used on things like seashells, ray stones, or most of the time they try to use grain, but that didn't last for long because grain is just a very, very bad monetary token. So gold has the advantage of having actually very little use case, especially before modern electronics. It had basically, besides being pretty in a necklace, it really had no use case at all in the actual economy, which is good because basically whenever a good is used both as money and in the real economy, you have a conflict because the use of money draws away from the economy and vice versa. But it's actually good to have a tool that is constant. And the only thing you need is a constant supply, that you have this normation effect. That basically, if I have 1 Bitcoin now, even in 1,000 years, that 1 Bitcoin will still be 1/20 millionth of the whole value in the economy that uses Bitcoin. I mean, obviously, the side of the economy that uses Bitcoin might change and everything, so it's never perfect. But you know that your portion of all purchasing power must remain the same. And with gold, that was as close as we got to that before, because roughly 1 to 2% of gold new supply can be mined. And it cannot really go up until we have asteroid mining. But even with gold can have inflation, and very bad ones. I mean, we had this when in the 1600s when the New World was discovered and exploited. This meant basically that the wealthy people suddenly imported a lot of gold and silver. A lot compared to and basically in the 1400s, the peasants were already very, very free and had very, very many rights. And then basically this gold and silver inflation from the New World set them back several centuries, which is why in the 1500s and stuff, you had these peasant wars and all of that. That's because the people realized that they were being screwed over by basically the powerful people having essentially found meters as touch and to create gold and silver almost for free. Mm. So really the thing that matters is how many tokens are there and how does the amount of tokens change over time. And the ideal case is not at all.
Okay. I've spoken to several economists who fundamentally disagree. I don't know. Are you familiar with Steve Keen?
Not really, but I've also spoken to several economists. But
so they right.
I mean, I failed to convince a Eurosceptical finance professor why 0-point inflation in a technologically advancing economy is still a redistribution from the bottom to the top. It's like it's kind of comical how bad economic education is. That actually, if you go out and ask the poorest street merchant in Bangladesh, he knows more about how money and the economy works than any of the top economists. Because simply by finishing the degree, and the higher you get up, the worse it gets, you prove that you can successfully either lie or just ignore reality. That's how you get there. And I've seen it with even a friend of mine. He's a really very brighter than I, and he's he studied Austrian economics on his own, and he was really the best economist I personally knew. And then he did his PhD in economics. Basically, he's still great, but I realized on some of his takes that even on him, it hasn't missed him come, because some takes I say, hey, come on, what's that nonsense? And I realized that he basically, even him, these like 6 or 7 years of indoctrination has left some scars where it's just unthinkingly repeating some stuff that he learned there that's blatantly false. And I say that as an engineer, because an engineer cares about how stuff works. And there's certain principles in engineering analysis of how the world works that just disagree with mainstream economics. And to be frank, as an engineer, if engineering tells me the economists are wrong, I trust engineering.
Well, they're the ones dealing with like real stuff, I guess. Like that's who you'd want to listen to. So you also reminded me of this idea that the more educated you become, the more you ignore the reality of the world, because like your education has taught you that this is the way, and therefore, that's how it is. It reminds me of there's a lady called Casey Means who's written a book about metabolic health in America, and she said basically the more specialized you become in medicine, the less you're able to take a step back and understand how like health works as a whole. Sort of quite a nice parallel there. And also, I thought you're
Hannah Arendt, we do know. Hannah Arendt was a survivor of Nazi Germany that then also gave many talks in English, and he wrote that, not really a book, more a long essay, but he wrote that book about the Eichmann process in Israel, and about the banality of evil, and he very, very precisely explained what makes ordinary people evil, and why and how especially the elite, the intellectuals, are the ones that fall for it the fastest and the hardest.
Yeah, well, we see plenty of examples of that in the world today. So to move towards your book, so essentially Bitcoin Nation is an idea that mirrors, I think, well, you can probably explain that slightly better than me, but my understanding at least is that you have used the Jewish community that is scattered throughout the world as a mirror of how a community or a nation could organize itself without borders and without needing to be all in one specific place. Essentially, is that about right?
The first part of the book, I just tried to explain money in modern terms, so to recap Agatharis and say why Bitcoin solves all the problems he explained about the gold standard. And then I started thinking about how will a society change on a Bitcoin standard, because money is the foundation of a society. It heals every interaction outside of friends and family, and even some in friends and family. So building a society on weak money is like building a skyscraper on quicksand. It just doesn't work. And I think you can keep it around with human ingenuity, but I think that the Tower of Pisa will stand longer than any fiat currency. And the issue is that basically, as I said, this technology limits. When the money degrades, the limits technologically and also sociologically, and then the society can be at degrades. So the morals get worse, and that's not that all the people just conspire to, we will be evil now. It's just a vicious cycle of causes and effects that leads that down that path. So I was thinking, what is in the other way? If we have a better monetary technology now than ever before, we have the internet. And I mean, the book Sovereign Individual in the mid-90s predicted a lot that the internet would bring, and this conflict of basically the internet empowering the ordinary citizen, and really over time taking power away from the media, from the government, from the rich, the elites, so-called. So they predicted this in the mid-90s very, very accurately. But what they didn't predict was Bitcoin. And So I was thinking, really, what casting out further, how will Bitcoin change how society is organized and current trends? And what I then realized is that actually there already is a trend to decentralization, not just decentralization in the sense as Bitcoin is decentralized, but actually societal decentralization. You see these digital nomads that essentially take around the world, go to a country where living costs are low, where taxes are low, and they just work remotely over the internet. And on the other hand, for serious demographic problem. Because a fiat economy is the biggest Ponzi scheme at all. It requires ever more people in each generation to keep working because the monetary base exponentially grows. So the only way to keep that up is to grow the population exponentially. But that's not happening. Population is declining in most countries and soon will be, or is at least predicted to be, will be declining globally. And the pity is the countries that still have a growing population usually are really well equipped in educational infrastructure. So it's very hard for the rich nations to basically recruit the missing taxpayers into their social systems from most African nations, because just basically if you get somebody as a child there and then educate that child, it just takes longer than we have to actually fix the problem. So the nations that already have a lot of skilled, educated workers have to compete fiercely for these workers. And that there is a thing about human migration that basically in normal times around 5 to 10% of humans there uproot themselves and move somewhere else. The worse the time gets, the more it is. But even in the worst times, like the Irish famines or when the Huns came along, that it's usually not more than 30 or 35%, even in the worst of times, that are willing to uproot themselves. So no matter how good you compete as a country, the math just doesn't work out. You just, in the next 10, 20, 30 years, you run into a problem that you don't have enough skilled workers. I mean, maybe there's a technological miracle. Maybe AI and Elon Musk's robot and everything will replace workers, but I don't think that's true. And even then, it wouldn't matter, because even then, still, one skilled worker using these robots, using AI, will likely still outperform, and the countries that attract these people will still outperform and outcompete others, but could alleviate that population decline issue. But to be honest, I don't think it will get there in time either before that problem really gets big. So what I think is that nations will start to try and recruit taxpayers that don't actually live there. I mean, the US is already doing that. If you're a US citizen and move anywhere else in the world, you still have to pay taxes in the US.
What? Really?
Yes. Yes.
For what?
And that because they still protect you, they do, but they also will just force you. I mean, Roger Ver, for example, I mean, I really don't like the guy, but he essentially revoked his citizenship, paid all his taxes, and then they came and invaded his home in, I don't know which country, some Cayman Islands, Bahamas, somewhere. He was living somewhere in another country, and the US authorities said, you haven't paid enough. So basically he paid, revoked his citizenship, paid his tax, moved away, and they hunted him down, dragged him back to the US and put him on trial in the US.
Wow.
Yeah, that's but I think this will more and more happen in a good way, because I mean the downside of this is, I mean, look at Brittany Griner, for example. This was this US basketball star who was imprisoned for marijuana in Russia.
Yeah,
I think obviously she was also famous, which gave her better services than the ordinary citizen, but still, they actually let go a very evil weapons trader and warlord in exchange for her, and the US government bailed her out, got her free, got her back to the US. But she actually had a benefit of being a US citizen outside of the USA. And I think this is just what will happen, that more and more countries say, hey, you can get our passport without moving here. You pay us some money and you get these services. And the harder this competition gets, the better and the more powerful these services will get, until essentially I predict that at some point territorial states will just cease to exist. And the interesting thing about this is that, coming back to what you said, that we actually have an example of such a decentralized nation working, which is the Jewish diaspora. They, for 2,000 years, didn't have a territorial country of their own, but still they organized themselves, they traded, they had a lot of their own law and education systems. It worked very well, so much so that other nations got envious and prosecuted them. And then when they were persecuted, they basically helped as many of the people escape. And you always should see the bad side, right? All these pogroms, the Holocaust. You see all that and say, "Oh my God, this was so bad for them not having a territory of their own." Yeah. If we look at other similarly small territorial nations that even were very successful, like Carthage or the Hanseatic cities, Venice, all of them eventually, no matter how good they performed, in the end, the small territorial size was always fatal, because at some point they either made a blunder or just enough neighbors banded together because they were angry to just overrun them by sheer numbers. So this is the flip side. Yeah, they suffered very horrible, but for such a small nation, they survived, while most others didn't.
So what other benefits do you envision coming along with this digital citizenship? Because I was trying to think about it, and I hadn't thought about that. The legal protections, that's definitely a good one, right? What other ones do you think? And do you not think that countries would still, or whichever area you lived in, would demand taxes for, I don't know, roads or property or things like that? Like,
yeah, but I mean the diplomatic services mostly. I mean, you see this right now, right? The EU tries to regulate, sanction, harass X. Now Trump has said, no, if you do that, you'll get problems. You get tariffs. I may pull out of NATO. That's what Trump's doing for Elon Musk right now, and his overseas locations of X and things like this. I think will get more and more. That maybe not only for a US company, but maybe a company that just basically pays the US or a person. And I think, to be honest, yes, the territorial nations for a while will probably lead that trend and maybe even gobble up more territory. But in the end, I think the game dynamics are just in the way that this territorial structure will crumble. And that's a good thing. Because I think really all of our problems we have with nation states as they are right now result from them being a territorial monopolist. But that they basically have very, very little market pressures. Because it's very hard to move from one state to another. You have to sell your house. You basically, like with the US, they might still just raid your home in another country, drag you back and say you haven't paid enough taxes. But the more competition there is between states, and once you actually can get a new citizenship without moving, or at some point even entirely switch it without moving, the less problematic it will be, because states will actually compete each other, or maybe better call them state service providers at this point. And the crazy thing is, I try a little bit of prediction in my book, but I was really holding back, because essentially, who 100 years ago could have predicted the iPhone? Most people couldn't have done it 20 years ago. And I think it's impossible to predict what 100 years of free market competition would do to states. The only thing that we can logically deduct is that for the ordinary citizen, or for humanity as a whole, it will be much better, because that's just what the market process does. If we are the market, because everybody voluntarily cooperates, everybody must cooperate to something that he or she perceives beneficial. So the overall trend, of course, there's ups and downs, there's failures, there's people violating the principles and doing mafia-style free market, I think basically forcing others. But the overall trend in a free market is rapid progress. And I think that will happen also to state services.
That's a very interesting way of putting it. Well, I mean, that would be beautiful. So hopefully you're right. I mean, it remains to be seen, but, you know, the reasons to be positive for the future. So, yeah, Michael, I want to thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure chatting to you. I will put the link for your book in the description below. People can buy it or listen to it or whatever they like. I got to say, it was really interesting, both educational in terms of like helping me understand better about hard money and Bitcoin, as I've spoken to many people, but you know, there's always more to learn and understand because, yeah, complicated concepts being battled around.
Yeah, as that you just discover new tunnels in the rabbit hole. The deeper you go, the more you know how much you don't know.
Yeah, that really is very, very accurate. But yeah, so thanks for your time, man. Is there anything you want to plug aside from the book before we go?
My company, Opego, is helping merchants, both small and big, accept Bitcoin over lightly. So if anybody's interested in that, opego.com, you can check it out. We have a small POS device for stores, and we also have an API for bigger companies or even enterprises. And doesn't hurt you going to a better money than your competition.
Well, can't deny that. Can't wait to see. Well, look at MicroStrategy. They're going through the roof. Can't wait to see what other companies will decide to buy Bitcoin and put it on their balance sheet. And possibly what nations. Let's see. So yeah, thanks very much, man. It's been a pleasure.
Hey, listeners, real quick. Do you ever find yourself sitting watching the stock market like this? Well, now you could instead be ordering my book like this. It's the story of GameStop. You can purchase it with a hoodie, with acknowledgements, or just with the early backers edition. It's all about the GameStop story. It's the real story, not just what you've seen on films. It's exactly what has happened over the last 3.5 years. And with DFE back, I'm finally able to draw a conclusion to my book. Please pre-order it. It really helps me out, and you will get it eventually, I promise. Hopefully this year.